Well, he's supporting Cambodians seeking accountability after genocide, solving cold cases about American MIAs in Southeast Asia, inventing ocean life-saving equipment for American special operations units, or aiding young veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Professor and author Peter Maquire has devoted his life to helping others and the pursuit of justice. Since he received his PhD with distinction from Columbia University in 1993, Maquire has never received a grant or fellowship or held a full-time academic position. Yet his research and scholarship on the Nuremberg trials, international criminal law, Khmer Rouge atrocities, and smuggling has been internationally recognized. Peter is the founder of the Feigning Robin Foundation, Feigning Robin being a reference to a line in an Emily Dickinson poem, that provides financial support to independent scholars, writers, and thinkers whose work falls outside the mainstream. Peter also publishes the Sour Milk Substack, and I wanted to get him on the channel to talk about one of his recent posts titled American War Crimes. Let me read the opening paragraph. Recently, many people have asked me if the Trump administration's decision to target and destroy the Venezuelan boats is a war crime. The simple answer is yes, and the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, ultimately bears responsibility. However, the legacy media's sudden interest in these micro war crimes, while they continue to turn a blind eye to macro war crimes, reeks of what Joseph Conrad best described as, quote, the self-righteous stench of the converted sinner, end quote. Peter, welcome to the channel.
Thank you for having me.
So talk to us about the macro war crimes that the legacy media is ignoring.
Well, I would trace them all the way back to really 9/11, when most conspicuously Vice President Cheney said we're taking the gloves off. We're, Hague and Geneva are not going to be guiding this war. And then that rapidly moved to renditions and torture and things that we all know about then. At the time, I was investigating war crimes in Cambodia, and hearing rumors of the quote enhanced interrogation facility in southern Thailand. And our global war on terror effort at that time was very anarchic. I also had a young Green Beret come to me who had committed what were war crimes under Hague and Geneva, under orders, but got caught and was getting ready to be thrown under the bus as the scapegoat in what I describe in my books as primitive political justice. For example, you get the trigger puller. You don't move up the chain of command and you say, oh, the Abu Ghraib 7, oh, a few bad apples. How could that have happened? We're going to get right to the bottom of that. That's primitive political justice. That's very simple. And then, outside of the United States, what we've had going on in the Congo, really since the late 90s, what is going on in the Middle East in terms of, you can argue whether genocide, crimes against humanity, whatever it is, if nothing else, it's an incredibly disproportional response to 1,000 killings, 70,000, at least half of them women and children. Again, the legacy media picks and chooses what they're going to focus on. Yeah, this involves Trump bad, let's pile on. But, we're talking about 80 individuals killed in the Caribbean. And, it's the case Carroll and Levitt's trying to make is pretty silly in the sense that it was self-defense or some kind of military necessity. It doesn't bear the slightest scrutiny. I mean, these are, again, it doesn't meet the nexus of international armed conflict that's going to bring in international humanitarian law. I would say no. Then we get to, if we're really serious about dealing with cartels, we start in Mexico. When did that all really begin in Mexico? It began with NAFTA. It began with our blessings. The cartels don't only traffic in drugs. They traffic in humans. They traffic in commodities. They traffic in money. Look at Wachovia, Wells Fargo, HSBC. They all got cracked for washing the cartel's blood-stained billions during the financial crisis. They were one of the few hard currencies left in the banking system. And The brilliant British investigative reporter Ed Villamy, he wrote all about it. And we're talking about 2010, and no one was punished for that. This has deep taproots. And if we want to get into the opiate crisis, well, let's go to the American pharmaceutical industry. I mean, that's who bears the greatest responsibility for America's opiate epidemic. So for someone like myself that's seen and been writing about this stuff for a very long time, it's quite frustrating to have, these people who have turned a blind eye to these issues and then swan in at a politically convenient moment to, make this grand case about, again, I'm not a supporter of this action in Venezuela. It's a bit short-sighted, a bit theatrical, like most things Trump. Um, I ultimately don't know where it will go. I fear that we may get ourselves into something much more serious than we realize. I don't think, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm hoping that it's theater, but really, who knows? This is a mercurial president.
All right, I just got this package from the sponsors of this episode, REC Watches, and if it's what I think it is, it's going to be awesome. So let's do an unboxing here. This Habu timepiece isn't just inspired by history, it's built from it. It carries the DNA of the legendary SR-71 Blackbird. This watch is made from the most flown Blackbird, number 61-7956. The titanium in the watch is specifically from the turkey feathers. They were part of the design that allowed the jet to go upwards of Mach 3. And all the other elements, from the case to the cockpit-inspired dial, are tributes to the iconic legacy of the Habu, as the SR-71s based in Kadena were known, named after the local pit viper there. Wearing this watch is a real conversation starter, and a classy one at that. So if you go to the REC website and use the coupon code WARD, you'll get an extra 10% off. The link is in the episode description, so check it out. You bringing up the Bush 43 dynamic, I think a lot of people forget. We just lost Vice President Cheney. It's interesting how the nation didn't really mourn that much. I mean, flags were at half-mast, but you point out in the American War Crimes Substack just some of where his fingerprints were on this sort of conflating of the thesis, where it's not unlike what you just mentioned, which is fentanyl is now a chemical weapon. Drug mules are now narco-terrorists. They've conflated fentanyl with cocaine. And, it's like if you're seriously, you've ascribed 100,000 to 300,000 deaths per year to fentanyl, that doesn't come from Venezuela. And these boats that you are taking out aren't carrying it. So if you truly care about the source, we'd go after China.
Exactly.
We're not doing that.
Yeah.
But you bring up, and it's interesting in the legacy media, these sort of savants that make those editorial choices on a daily basis. They made George W. Bush, like this great guy, and there's he and Obama at the funeral cracking up, and he's the good guy when you contrast him with Trump. And we forget, we let him off the hook sort of in the pop culture about all of the sort of sins of that administration.
Yeah, and the fact that, where did all that blood and treasure go? What did it earn us? It didn't earn us anything in the end. And where I stopped really being that involved in international war crimes was once I saw the road that our country was going down, and once I saw the way that our country was using not using our soldiers that are now veterans that I now counsel, in that, in the Vietnam War, you served one tour and that was it. You were out. But I mean, I saw guys getting recalled that weren't tier 1 guys, that were average infantrymen and stuff like that, really taking their entire youth. And while they looked great on the outside and everything else. And I teach jujitsu, so I meet many of them through that. They were truly damaged from that experience, and seeing that, they go their first tour, they're fighting with the Shia. The second tour, they go back, they're fighting with the Sunni. They're saying, well, wait, wasn't that like, it doesn't take Buckminster Fuller to figure out that something's very off. And again, my problem is, you go back to Clausewitz, it's, you have to have coherent policy objectives to successfully use military force. Force is, basically, military force is the hammer, policy is the brain. And if the hammer and the brain don't talk, you hit yourself in the face. And the remake of the new Syrian president into a great guy, and I mean that whole Syrian Obama era ouster of Assad, I mean that hasn't gotten the scrutiny that it well deserved. And so I feel like the United States has gotten really off on a wrong road, and to the point now, and I've written about this, where it's so far gone that we almost need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm not a fan of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but it's the only mechanism when you have an unresolved conflict within a society that's so divided that the criminal justice system's been polluted because it's been politicized. And I'd say we're getting damn close to that because, again, I'm not a Trump supporter, but some of the cases that were brought against him were pretty ridiculous. And it just, and they failed at the end of the day, and they strengthened him at the end of the day. And I would tell many of my extreme liberal friends, because I'm a product of extreme liberal education, and worked for some of the press organs as well, is that if you just gave Trump the rope to hang himself, he'd be gone by now. But it's just, the society's going to end, democracy, blah, 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 blah. From the same guys who brought us the Iraq War, from the same apologists. So that's what's particularly frustrating to me. Like I saw, Andrew Sullivan crowing on, we're Americans, we're better than that. We don't torture. That's his exact line. And he was a cheerleader for the Iraq War. And, again, I just, for people who haven't done the military heavy lifting and having an administration full of draft dodgers, sending people into harm's way to do things they never did. That's the red thread that runs throughout American history, which is hypocrisy. That is our greatest foreign policy export. And I think there's and I'm not saying this kind of facetiously, but you look at the roots of the United States and you have the Virginia colonies, and then you have Plymouth Rock. And we kind of want to go, oh, Plymouth Rock, that's us. No, it's the drug colony in Virginia, where it was complete anarchy. But you have these strands of, individual freedom, and then you have slavery. And so that founding contradiction really shapes us. And there's just a kind of delusion to what we're doing now, a kind of politics of public relations that was instituted during Bush-Cheney years, which was, we can create reality. We will make reality, and events will follow our conception of reality. And obviously that hasn't worked out.
Well, and then to challenge that reality, that narrative, as you saw during Bush 43 and is going on now, is to be unpatriotic. And in some cases, you might get deplatformed, even blackballed, right? So we're kind of in that atmosphere again.
I have the unique distinction of being someone who was blackballed both by the Bush administration and the Biden administration. My book, Law and War, got pulled into the Dirty Bomber case. His defense attorneys contacted me. And I come from a legal tradition My PhD advisor was Brigadier General Telford Taylor, chief prosecutor at Nuremberg. My great grandfather was a judge at Nuremberg. And if someone respectfully approached Telford Taylor for a legal opinion, even if it was David Irving, he would politely respond, right? He didn't have to like him. And that's kind of the intellectual culture I was raised in, of respectful disagreement, not you're ad hominem, oh, you're a horrible person, or, to quoque, you also, like you try to talk about the Middle East and you say, well, this response is disproportional. Well, Hamas uses this and hides bombs, and you say, okay, but that's the Tequoque defense. It's inadmissible in any court.
Well, you're either a Zionist or you're anti-Semitic, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's a
and
binary thing.
and like in my case, my grandfather ran Operation Magic Carpet and Operation Alibaba. He probably flew at least 40 to 50,000 Yemenites, concentration camp survivors, into Israel in the late 40s. Supposedly Ben Gurion called him the Irish Moses. He received their highest medal, and he was a contractor. But in any case, by the end of his life, he was quite disillusioned with what Israel had turned into, and he was anything but an anti-Semite or anything else. I remember having a dinner with a bunch of very fancy New York City intellectuals and journalists right as we were invading Iraq, and all these flaming liberals, New Yorker writers, and the fancy of the fancy, really got upset with me for not supporting the invasion of Iraq. And I was absolutely stunned, because these are people that have never been in a fist fight, much less a firefight, and they were all had turned into these big hawks.
Talking about General Taylor, I heard you tell Jocko that he was kind of like the John Houseman character in The Paper Chase.
Yeah, sheer terror, and you didn't know if he hated you or not. And anytime I would interview him, like, a lot about the Nuremberg trials, and and the second you asked him an off-topic question, he would say, "Well, I see we're finished today," and you are done. You are out of there. But I finally got to see that he liked me during my PhD defense, when some jackass on my committee said, well, I don't know about war crimes, and I don't think General Van Manstein's any less of a war criminal than Curtis LeMay. And Taylor had done the Manstein case, and he said, very politely, and then some fancy guy from the Council on Foreign Relations said, yeah, I agree with you. And Taylor said, he goes, sir, not so fast. And he's like in his late 80s, and he's super old. And they keep going on talking over him, blah, blah, blah. And then he just yells, sir, you don't know what it is about which you're speaking. And it was like Zeus threw the thunderbolt down on the table. And I was like, yes, I just passed my dissertation. That's over. And so Taylor, and then when I was doing investigations in Cambodia, I would go and see him and show him what I found. And he would say, yeah, absolutely, these are war crimes. And these people should be held accountable. And, some of them were. It was a pretty half-hearted UN effort. I fall in a very uncomfortable space, because I never drank from the golden cup of Soros, and during that really bizarre period from the end of the Cold War to 9/11, we have a period of history very much like the period between World War I and World War II, where you have the Kellogg-Briand Treaty coming out, outlawing war as an instrument of national policy, and all this utopian stuff, very much like we had in the 90s, where the International Criminal Court is going to make the world safe for everyone. And, we have Samantha Powers calling for a UN investigation of Bob Kerrey for his war crimes in Vietnam. And it was lunacy. And none of these people really knew their ass from their elbow legally. And if you got on a stage with them, it was not a pretty picture. And so I tended to get invited to things once. And, and the Soros people, it was kind of I wasn't impressed. And I saw that, he had a huge influence, not in a crazy Masters of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or any of the more conspiracy laden stuff that tends to cling to Soros, but he, much to his credit, brilliantly used our system, brilliantly bought up journalists and human rights workers who then went on to work in politics, Samantha Powers, and the list goes on and on and on. So, in a funny way, he had the best private intelligence network in the world, and he was able to shape the international criminal law narrative and influence in a variety of ways, because academics and journalists are cheap tricks. I mean, I can buy a dozen of them by noon for probably 100 grand, and we see that over and over. And it's kind of sad that it's come to that. We don't pay journalists anymore. One of the old Nuremberg defense attorneys would say to me, always like, follow the money, follow the money. And so that I never forgot that. So
You mentioned Samantha Power, and immediately I think of the inside the Beltway think tank ecosystem, somewhere between Heritage and the Center for New American Securities. As you point out, there are the guilty bastards on both sides of the aisle. And so they just sort of bounce between, oh, I'm here at this think tank, and then I'm going to be the ambassador to the UN or the policy wonk at the Pentagon because it's a Democratic president. And then I'll go back to the think tank, or I'll be on retainer for Fox News or CNN or MS Now, whatever they're calling themselves
yeah.
these days. Right. And so the thing, you can dismiss it as harmless. However, as you rightly point out, particularly in this Substack that you just posted, it yields action and military force from time to time, and sends us down these vectors of peril nationally, in a way that you have to be aware of if you want to prevent it from happening again.
I think what was particularly troubling for me about Trump was how, the neoliberals and the neoconservatives coalesced in the name of anti-Trump, and how all was forgiven and forgotten. All you had to say is never Trump, and hey, forget about renditions, forget about torture. And so once Liz Cheney, and my liberal Hollywood director mother, is kind of going, Liz Cheney, hey mom, no, no, no. Like, I try not to talk to you about politics, but that Liz Cheney non-starter, Dick Cheney non-starter. I never celebrate anyone's death. I think that's a horrible recent phenomenon that people have gotten into in America, where they wish death on people, they celebrate deaths of people. I don't do that. Dick Cheney died. His family's welcome to grieve them. I won't. But it was too much to bear.
Because we've talked about Nuremberg, and you do a really cool job in this American War Crimes Substack of contrasting, because what we're talking about here is we talk about how now suddenly George W. Bush is this fun guy. As we said before, he and Obama are high-fiving at the funeral. And so what you do in this Substack, and this is the reason I wanted you on for this episode, is you contrast the Nuremberg trials with Guantanamo Bay in terms of rules of law, and again, how people play loose and free and use something as a predicate, but not accurately.
Well, Nuremberg was certainly imperfect. You have the first international trial that tries 22 of the senior Nazis. Then you have 12 American trials that try another 185 industrialists, bankers, lawyers, genocidists, and they followed an imperfect but consistent set of standards, where you had your traditional, what I call micro war crimes, battlefield crimes and atrocities, but then you have the more macro crimes like crimes against humanity, which is was created because crimes against German nationals technically isn't a war crime. They're your own nationals. There's no nexus of armed conflict there. So that becomes the mechanism. Some argue as ex post facto law in order to get around that. There was never torture. There was never forced confessions. There was never anything like that. And the Gitmo trials, and I know Mo Davis a little bit, who was the prosecutor who resigned. They were just kind of making up the standards as they went along and checking in with the vice president's office, and he was sending them staffers. And the real problem that they face is so much of the evidence was obtained through torture. And so, I mean, we've got some bad legal precedent in American history, like the Dakota Sioux case. The largest mass execution in American history is in 1862 during the Civil War. We try and hang 38 Sioux Indians who commit atrocities against settlers. We have the Henry Wirz case after the Civil War of the Andersonville Commandant. The Yamashita case, which is interesting to me, the Japanese general who was in charge of Manila, who was convicted and executed by MacArthur, and the great precedent of command responsibility we hear over and over comes out of that case. The problem is Yamashita retreated from Manila, was I don't know exactly the distance, but out of all communications with Manila. The Japanese Marines and Navy came in and committed the atrocities. So it's a very shaky precedent, to say the least. So that said, we would have to go back to those precedents of real, quote, primitive political justice to find something to match Gitmo. And that's why the thing is stalled out so bad. And I don't see the purpose of carrying on this farce much longer. I think I don't have an easy answer of what to do, because when I worked on the Jose Padilla case, he had been held in sensory deprivation for something like 2 years before he got to meet his lawyers. By the time he met his lawyers, he mentally was so far gone that he had Stockholm syndrome. And he was asking his own lawyer, well, what does the commander in chief want? Well, we've got to stay on the same page as the commander in chief. And they're just looking at him going, what the fuck happened to this guy? And so, and the idea, we held that up. Oh, the dirty bomber, we got him. And he was going to set off a radioactive device, blah, blah, blah. This guy was a prison Muslim, Puerto Rican gangbanger, converts in prison, then decides he wants to go join Al Qaeda and all that. He goes to Afghanistan, and the Al Qaeda guys are like, this guy is so stupid. I think maybe we could get him to go into an apartment building and turn on the gas and blow up an apartment building. And so if this is the thing we fear, then we've been consumed by our fear. And that's what bothers me about America today, is that we've turned into a country of pussies and snitches. Pardon my French. And I was raised never to snitch, and I got busted with a car full of weed. I didn't snitch. I got, I could have made my life a lot easier had I snitched, and I never did. That was absolutely forbidden by my tribal code of ethics. And I don't get it. Like, my kids were in school, and if a kid acts out, they basically bring a cop in. Like, the teacher can't even discipline them. I mean, it's gotten so perverted as to what we've become as a society. And again, fear is a crippling thing. And as you know from your old line of work, I mean, everybody experiences fear. It's what you do in the face of fear that really defines you. And so the moron says, I'm not afraid, I'm never scared, blah, blah, blah. But, the person, even, my old jiu-jitsu teacher, Hickson Gracie, he's like, I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid of everything, but I know how to manage my fear, and I don't want safety. I had a professor, Mary McCarthy, a novelist, and she would talk about the lion's freedom and the lamb's freedom. And she would say they're not the same thing. You know, the lion just wants to bleat in the field and get his oats or whatever it is he eats. You know, the lion, you know, he wants to go rip some throats out, and if he breaks his leg, the hyenas are going to get him. And that's the lion's freedom. That risk comes with true freedom. And, you know, there is an inherent risk with freedom that we've seemed to have lost sight of. And this tinny kind of, you know, it's just the whole political objectives of the global war on terror. Freedom. I mean, what are the metrics for that? How do you define it? How do you know when you've achieved it? And I think Bush, you know, I almost feel sorry for him today, because I think he was kind of a simpleton, to be honest, and I think that he got used, and I think he and you know, fairly well into his presidency, I think he realized it. And that's when he sort of broke off from Cheney. But I remember when the family sent James Baker to go have a little sit down with him. And James Baker was the fixer, right? That was a sharp cookie. And when Bush kind of was like, I'm doing this myself, I went, oh, we got a problem. And so, yeah, I think we've lost sight of what we've been decultured in a way, you know, being decultured by 9/11. We've been decultured by the corporate cultural revolution of 2020. I mean, and people say, oh, but, you know, Trump, oh, the sky's falling, the sky's falling. And say, listen, in the early 2000s, it was God and country. And, you know, now it's abolish the police. There's no such thing as men or women. Like, we're a schizophrenic country, you know, like we swing wildly, whipsawing from polarity to polarity. And I think we've got to somehow try to reestablish some kind of center, and that's and civility and those. And I don't know if we can do it. You know, again, like we're in the so-called clapback culture, and that to me is, you know, like in my intellectual game that I played and all that, is the second you go after your opponent with an ad hominem attack, oh, you're a drunk, you cheat on your wife or whatever, you've lost, you've been disqualified, forfeit. But now that's common intellectual discourse. I mean, I was looking at Trump's Truth Social stuff today about Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's just like, you know, somebody take the phone away from the guy after 9 p.m. and he doesn't even drink.
Well, it's also it's just part and parcel to the tenor, whether it's Hegseth at the podium, he's got to go after the press, you know, and he's got to go after Biden and Milley and, you know, all of that, which kind of diminishes the narrative, whether you're talking about the national defense policy or procurement reform or whatever. Because I'm watching and I'm like, he's kind of got a good point here. And then he just sort of ruins it by attacking Biden or Milley, you know, with the same old stuff. Same with Trump. You know, in the last 24 hours, he said, "Yeah, I'm okay if they go ahead and you know, put the reattack or the double tap out to the public." And then he goes after the reporter that asks the question. You're a horrible person, you know. And now it seems like he doesn't want to release it, but it has to come with this ad hominem attack, which it makes it undignified, and that's where the Trump critics, you know, roll in on the whole thing categorically. Back to the post 9/11 sort of dynamic, because it's happening again, which is we're told under the auspices of this national fear, whether it's 9/11 or boogeymen bringing fentanyl into the country, that the rules should be suspended, in essence. I'm paraphrasing. Nobody said that, but it's like, this was the Patriot Act. This is what we're saying lately is the post World War II rules-based world order is no longer serves America. So therefore we have to suspend parts of it, so forth and so on. This is what you point out about Gitmo. It's like whatever jurisprudence traditionally demanded needs to be suspended, because these aren't the Germans. This isn't the Third Reich. These are Islamic fundamental terrorists. They don't play by our rules. So that's always the petition. And then in hindsight, it always goes wrong. It's also, as you look, there are people who tend to benefit from the suspension of the rules-based order, right? There are organizations, companies, individuals that always benefit. Well, it's Halliburton or whoever's going to benefit from however the Ukrainian war ends up, or what's happening with Netanyahu. There's always some corporation, like you say, follow the money. So it seems to be really exceptionally egregious with respect to Gitmo, because I'm like you. I'm like, how is this still open, and how have we not done a national, like I said, truth and reckoning and reconciliation? And why doesn't the public care?
I think our body politic has been steamrolled since 9/11, and they're weary. They don't know what to believe. Um, we're in this kind of post-truth culture where, the terms, disinformation, malinformation, conspiracy theory have very much been weaponized. And ironically, it was Samantha Power's husband who was one of the ones who did it. Cass Sunstein, he wrote an article called Conspiracy Theories, and he lays out the strategy of how to kind of isolate and invalidate troublesome voices within a body politic. And this was really about, he wrote it in kind of how to deal with 9/11 conspiracy theorists. But then you can see that it kind of takes on a life of its own with this new forms of technology, where you can live edit, where you can algorithm memory hole, where you can really manipulate in ways that threaten our freedom of speech, much more so than in the era of printed media. And then you have what I call the tech Mongols, who the big boys of big tech that have now kind of made so much money they've turned into strange utopians, wanting this kind of post-human future that I want absolutely no part of. I don't want a car that won't let me do donuts, much less, some kind of preemptive bad behavior algorithm, because I'll certainly kick that thing off just for the sake of it. Because if you tell me not to do something, typically I will do it just because. And I don't like it. I don't like any morality being dictated to me. I have never been a member of a political party. Um, I kind of only speak for myself, but I I like freedom. I live, in North Carolina because, the ocean's nearby and I can surf. That is the main reason, but it's a pretty free place. The cops are relatively cool. You can drive on the beaches, you can have guns, you can make fires. It's not this weird snitch culture with CCTVs and all this crap. I want no part of that. I don't want a dishwasher with Wi-Fi. I have a I have a crappy old BMW stick shift that's got like, hundreds of thousands of miles on it. And I'll probably never sell it because I don't want to, I don't want to get one of these cars that listens to me and, drives for me and all this other stuff.
So you don't want a television in your refrigerator, Peter? Come on.
No, none of it. I don't even have cable. I'm going backwards, I'm going backwards and just kind of going lower tech with my old age. So
I want to ask you about the micro war crime circumstance, and then I want
sure,
to go back macro.
sure.
Uh, but first the micro one. So Hegseth is meeting with, they're calling the Gang of Eight. What do you think is going to happen here with that micro war crime?
I think it'll largely be theatrical, and there will be some kind of horse trading. I don't see Hegseth as I see him under taking on a lot of water pretty fast in general as the Secretary of Defense. I mean, that Signalgate thing was stunningly amateur. But as you said, the rank and file, he has support there.
And he has support from Trump, which is really what matters. And all Trump wants from his secretary of anything is be combative with the press and sing his praises in staff meetings in the Roosevelt room, right? And that's what he gets in spades.
For now, because there's no loyalty with Trump. There's no loyalty, and so if he becomes too much of a liability, then he'll be gone. But the thing is, again, like you know we're trying to use the same paradigm of the war on terror in the so-called drug war now. That, well, these are sort of illegal enemy combatants, and it's a strain at best. And so, you know, I would say that you'd have a hard time making a war crimes case because you don't have a state of war. But was it murder? Was, that's, by really, especially the 49 Geneva Conventions, all the way down, customary law, even World War One submarine law. You're obliged to pick up survivors from a shipwreck, or even if you caused the shipwreck. Some of those rules get ridiculously formal, where legally you're supposed to inform the ship that you're going to sink them, allow them to abandon ship, sink the ship, and then rescue the survivors. Obviously, that's going to break down in combat. At Nuremberg, you had an interesting thing where you had Admiral Dönitz, Hitler's successor in the Third Reich. He was tried for not rescuing survivors, and American Admiral Chester Nimitz testified on his behalf and said, no, we did the same thing. We didn't pick up survivors. It was too dangerous, because then the planes would get us. You run into where the rubber hits the road practicalities of war crimes that they don't talk about in Cambridge or New York City or those institutes in Washington, D.C., where, everything is, sort of pie in the sky. And I watched the UN in Cambodia take more time to try 3 geriatric Khmer Rouge leaders than it took to try every single German and Japanese war criminal after World War II. So, they tend to make the perfect the enemy of the good in those highfalutin UN worlds. That's why nobody really takes them seriously. I say, yeah, the ICC, it's a great court for fourth world despots who displease their international political masters. That's what it's for. But you're going to get Bibi in there, you're going to get Trump, you're going to get Putin. Good luck. You're going to get World War II. How many divisions do you have? Because enforcement has always been the Achilles heel of international law. And so that's where, in the 90s, I couldn't take it seriously because it was so utopian. And it was, but that's the micro question, but the macro question is, what are we aiding and abetting? What are we turning a blind eye to in the larger world, and as I've said for many years, if we were really serious about catastrophic human rights abuses and curtailing them, it would begin in the Congo. I mean, that's the longest, bloodiest series of wars that spill over into other countries that I've ever seen. Now there's strategic minerals and things like that that make it worth fighting for. But in the 90s, it was just, well, that's what they do, Nobody wanted to go cover the Rwanda trials. It was all The Hague. It was so sexy, but Bosnia didn't compare to Rwanda. I mean, Rwanda was the clearest case of genocide since World War II, period.
Yeah, well, again, follow the money kind of a thing, to be cynical about it. You point out during Nuremberg, or as the Third Reich was falling apart. And this is to your point about things that we're willing to overlook in the pursuit of our national interest which from time to time are very myopic. So the worst of the worst Nazis are like, I buried the Russia files. And if
Yeah.
you want them, right, we're going to have to do some things. It reminds me of Inglourious Bastards, where the Christopher Waltz character is like, I can end the war, but here's my conditions. That horse trading happens, but the degree to which, as the light of day is shown on it, starts to we cede the high ground. So talk to us about what happens specifically as we pivoted from Third Reich to all of a sudden Cold War, Soviet threat, because there were a lot of things, but specifically you point out this thing. Talk to us about that.
What happens after the end of the last Nuremberg trial in 1949 is you referred to Reinhard Gehlen, who was the Nazis' greatest Soviet expert. He took all their intelligence records and buried them, surrendered to the United States, and said, you can have all of it, and you can have my standing network of spies, but you got to let these 100 guys out. And they said, done. And so, they not only helped us in our early Cold War efforts, Gehlen winds up being the first intelligence director of the Federal Republic of Germany. And what he did so masterfully was exaggerate the Soviet threat. Oh, the Soviets have this many divisions ready to go. Well, half of them didn't have shoes. And he just would omit these inconvenient facts out. And we really were in over our head in Russia and Germany at that point. That's, these are not wars we've been fighting, the way that those, Russia and Germany had been fighting forever. And so we begin to see the need for German rearmament. They've always been the bulwark against the spring flood of Bolshevism, right? And so we really want to we want to rearm Germany, but then when the Korean War begins, we really want to rearm Germany. Some believe that the North Korean invasion might be a brush fire to distract us so that the Russians can break through in Western Europe. So, I mean, that's how the minds are racing. The Soviet ability to deliver, nuclear weapons, things like that, that comes much more quickly than we ever imagined. That terrifies us. And so what happens is what I call strategic legalism. And that is, the use of law, basically to use law to take you to your political destination, irrespective of the facts or the laws. You just read the laws to tell you whatever you want to hear. So what we begin to do with the Nazis is we begin to rewrite the parole and clemency standards so that people are sentenced to death. Like, we're talking about the Einsatz commandos, the worst of the worst, execution squads, sentenced to death, 47, 48. They're out as pension veterans, 53, 54. The last ones that are so unspeakably bad, they have to wait until 58 because the German veterans are saying, we are not rearming until you release our prisoners of war. And so, and we lose. And we lose that moral battle. We get the Bundeswehr, we get the German military, we get all that stuff. But in terms of the legacy of Nuremberg, blah blah blah, it's a much more serious thing. The most shocking thing I discovered, and I discovered this from Flottenrichter Otto Kranzbühler, who was the defense attorney of Alfred Krupp and Admiral Dönitz. And he got Krupp's fortune back. And this guy was a truly great defense attorney, irrespective of morality, whatever you think about the war, this or that. This guy was sharp. And so after his success at Nuremberg, the Adenauer administration brings him in when they're negotiating the treaties that reestablished German sovereignty in the early 50s. Huge 5,000-page treaties. And I go to his house in Tegernsee, that's like a castle, to interview him. He agrees to talk to me. And he pulls out the big treaty and he flips to a page. He says, "What's odd about Article 6, 11, and 7.1 on this?" I said, "Well, the exceptions before the rule. That's odd in law." And he said, exactly. I wrote it in invisible ink. And so he inserted this clause in the treaty reestablishing German sovereignty, invalidating every single Allied war crimes decision after World War II. And we went to the German justice minister and said, "Is this true?" And the guy was horrified and he said, "Oh, it could be interpreted that way." And so these are the things that go on behind the scenes that grown-ups are sad, but they know about, right? I mean, these are the things you saw when you were in the military, these Faustian alliances, ever changing, ever shifting. And, that's Weltpolitik. That's the world. And to kind of be the perpetual virgin that we try to be, it's not becoming. We're kind of mutton got up like lamb at this point.
These are things done in our name as just your average American citizen, that you may not have visibility. There's no rigor with your average American citizen to drill down on any of these things. And maybe at the end of the day, you don't really care because it doesn't affect your life.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to the micro war crime thing, which is, whether it's Tom Cotton or whomever, when we're like, this is like definitively a war crime to reattack survivors that are helpless. Like
Well,
you
it's
said,
murder too.
it's murder, right? So if it's not a declared war, it's murder. If it is a declared war, then it's a war crime.
Exactly.
Right? But then what, in the face of that being sort of put to him, they'll say, well, this is a different kind of enemy. If you guys want to wantonly kill 300,000 Americans every year, then that's on you, right? That kind of rhetoric, which is facile and lacking any kind of historical precedent. Further, and I've said this a few times on the channel, the reason these rules exist is to protect our troops. We're not terribly teary-eyed about what happens to Islamic, fighters on the field, or in World War II, what happened to the Nazis. But we do care if our guys get machine gunned when they're hanging onto the submarine as it's sinking, right? And so that's when we talk about, okay, you're putting your sons and daughters in harm's way. Wouldn't you want them to be afforded all the protections that savagery has yielded over the centuries?
And you look at the laws of war. Up until really almost the 20th century, these are customary laws. These are not codified laws. These are in the hands of soldiers, people who inhabit battlefields, right? It's within their prudential self-interest to observe these rules. If they don't, the other side doesn't, and all breaks down. And you see some incredibly brutal wars that are fought within the rules. You see some that aren't. I mean, it's interesting to contrast German conduct on the Eastern Front and German conduct on the Western Front in World War II. Totally different. Because they considered, the Russians pretty much subhuman, and they didn't consider the Europeans. And so, but as you correctly pointed out, this is within your own self-interest, and these are things usually internally policed by the military themselves, as it should be, right? Like in prison, if the Aryan Nation guy does something bad that's going to start a war with the Crips, the Aryan Nation guys are going to discipline him because they don't want a war with the Crips for no reason. And so then you get these third parties involved that aren't part of the culture, and then it gets stupid, to say the least.
Let's go back to, because we've done the micro thing, let's go back to the macro, because you did talk about some of the macro war crimes, but let me even expand the aperture even more broadly, which is, what does America have to do going forward to preserve the republic? I know that's pretty big. It's like a 50,000 foot topic, but do we have to put our phones down, cancel our Facebook accounts, elect lawmakers that are more moderate and willing to work across the aisle? What has got to happen here?
I think one of the biggest problems we face is that we're rapidly turning into a subliterate, illiterate society. And the rates at which American educational standards are plummeting, something like 20% of the freshman class at UCSD could barely read. 33% couldn't do elementary school math. So, it's gone from 30 or 40 students in remedial math at UCSD 4 or 5 years ago to 1,000 this year. So, I think, I think, you know, can we become a literate culture again? That's a question that I'm afraid to say what I really even think. Um, and because of that, and we're in this instant gratification world of phones and Twitter and Facebook and all that, that's now defined our political discourse. So there isn't time, there isn't room for, like we used to say with some war crimes cases, guilty but not guilty. Because, yeah, Henry V at Agincourt, he ordered, his soldiers to kill the archers of the French out of military necessity because it looked like the French were about to charge. So he gets a pass because the minute the French retreated, he rescinded the order. So that nuance, those gray areas, we're not allowed them anymore. It's binary. I got called a Trump supporter. I got called a Putin stooge. I got called, just for pointing out unpleasant truths about things. And so that's that space disappearing. That's very problematic. And there are some, as you've said in the last few minutes, that traffic in that space disappearing and profit by that space disappearing. And they just don't go away. And to see these people that, this kind of getting rewarded and rewarded and rewarded and just failing upward over and over and over again, it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating. And telling, quote, speaking truth to power, it's not a good industry these days. I've been sued for defamation, libel. I've been sued for copyright violation for using my own photo. I was hacked after I was told to kind of back off on some of the truths that I knew about Ukraine that I was writing. I was told by a former high-ranking government official to back off. What are my motives? And then I failed to back off, and all my social media accounts were hacked. Kiddie porn was put on all of them. I was deplatformed from all the Meta platforms. I had a friend who worked at Meta, and after going through every channel, it's impossible to call anyone. Oh, do you dispute this decision? Click this, click this. I did that, and then I called my friend who was an executive and said, "Hey, man, come on. I'm a lot of things I'm stupid about, but I'm not that stupid." And he got me back on. It took about a month, probably 30 emails. And one Sunday, maybe a week after I'd gotten back on, I'm on Facebook and I see these black squares popping up. Sexually inappropriate photograph of minor, sexually inappropriate photograph of minor. And they did the same thing to me again. And the second time, my friend didn't return my calls. And so that immediately cut the legs out of my revenue producing Substack. And so what I did was I said, what they want is me to shut up. So I'm not going to shut up, and I'm going to take a day job, and I'm going to keep writing, and I'm going to stop charging people, because I think we've reached a really tragic place as a society where the only thing we value are things that can be monetized, right? And like I got asked for a book proposal from a big editor, and I turned it in. You know, it was almost like, oh, this is just a walkthrough. I needed to get the thumbs up. And he said, well, where's your Twitter followers? Where I said, hey, I'm not on social media. I don't do any of that. Never heard from him again. And so there was a time where Americans valued culture, valued intellectual discourse, supported things that weren't guaranteed to make a profit, and that time is gone. Everything is about popularity, revenue, monetization. I mean, the stuff I deal with Hollywood, because, I'm a prostitute, not a whore. I pick who gets to do what they do to me. And, I turn some tricks in Hollywood with screenwriting. And the things that go on out there, you can scarcely imagine. And, recently I had a movie thing, and I was told that, it didn't fit this year's algorithm. I have a pretty strange background. I grew up on the sets of Robert Altman movies. My mom wrote Nashville. I was around, John Milius is a good friend. And that was an amazing era full of really creative people. And half of the movies sucked, but occasionally they'd hit a home run. And you can't quantify human taste. And Milius had a great quote where he said, "How dare they? How arrogant of them to think that they can predict human taste. There's only one man on earth who can do that, and that's Steven Spielberg, so you leave that to him." And creative endeavors are messy, and to bring in, kind of business school dorks trying to quantify it all. I mean, I have a documentary film right now I'm trying to sell. And one of the companies that just got caught in this big merger thing was supposed to, seem like they were going to buy it. Now they're for sale. And now it's just about money and business and all that. And I may just release it on Patreon. I've had it, because everywhere I turn, even being a New York Times bestselling author, there's a gatekeeper. And that gatekeeper first wants to know, not only can I monetize it, but how much money can I make? And we know I'm lying. I don't know how much money you can make. And so what? I'm going to tell you elaborate lies. And this is what I say about book proposals. By the time I'm done writing one of these lie-filled book proposals, I've forgotten what I was even writing about. It takes me about a month to get the magnet back in my compass to go whoa, oh yeah, okay, well, all right, I'm okay, yeah, let's go, but that's the culture we're in, and that's what hopefully could change. I mean, the Kardashians and Bezos, and these are not my idols, Peter Thiel, and these are cretins. I don't want any part of their world. And if that makes me a dissident, I'm going to have plenty of company in that gulag, and we're going to laugh and we're going to have fun, even if we get a cup of rice a day and have to work in the fields,
Well, the other thing about what you're talking about in terms of the revenue incentive is now the algorithms have tied the revenue with sort of doubling down on people's bias. So this is the other problem, is this just reinforces your bias. And so doing things that reinforce bias either direction yields the most revenue. So therefore, again, you don't have things that are provocative in any kind of way that promotes productive discourse or so forth and so on. This stuff is out there. It lives in YouTube channels, and it lives on Substacks like yours. So what it demands is people don't just wait to be served through a broadcast network or a Hollywood studio in a way that's going to make you smart like you need to be. You've got to kind of curate it yourself. And when you start doing that, then you realize, oh, I can be more productively informed and provoked in a way that challenges my point of view. And in that respect, now suddenly you're having more productive conversations with your golf buddies or the guys you went to college with or your neighbor, where you can actually talk about things, and not just when somebody says that one thing, you're like, oh, geez, we're in the company of a cult here, so let's just change the subject. And these conversations need to happen because they inform, your point of view towards local politics, not to mention who you vote for nationally. As we talk about how's it trending, how do we save the republic? Well, all of us have a fiduciary responsibility to do that.
The other thing, though, back to what you were saying about the new media, which is also precarious, is there's just a lot of complete crap that's well packaged, that unless you have a real solid background, you can get played. And that's what's really frightening about this instant communication world, and instant where, deep fakes and all this stuff, where you can really run psyops in a way that no one really had ever imagined outside of science fiction. And so, I really, my wife's on Twitter, and she'll start to tell me something about Twitter and this, and I'll say, okay, who's the source? And, sometimes I'll get taken by stuff and think it's real. And then I'll kind of scratch at it a bit and go, oh, that's that guy, and that he's carrying water for this guy or that. But that's 40 years of reading the news every single day and being part of the media that allows me to know that. Most people don't have the time or the luxury to do that. I think the worst thing that I see is people don't read anymore. And, people always say, oh, look at this video. I say, if I want to know about someone and I want to know their position, I want to read them so I can study them, so I can cross-reference them. And I think the loss of that's really tragic. And that, the 3 R's, just basic civics, basic arithmetic, basic writing, like we're losing these things. And we're so smitten with technology, and AI can do it. Well, AI lies to me all day long, right? And I'll say, oh, what about the precedent in this case? Boom, boom, boom. And I'll say, well, no, not exactly. What did Justice Rutledge say? Well, thank you for correcting me, my friend. You are so smart, much smarter than I will ever. I'm like, wait a minute. If I go public with this information, that's my reputation. And what are we doing with all this time that all this convenience is buying us? Like watching more porn, playing more video games? I mean, that's the tragedy of it. And then, I mean, my sons are 18 and 20, and the most staggering thing I saw during their school years was just the lack of physical activity, and the negative impact that had mostly on boys. And then the boys get classified as somehow this, and then they give them a bunch of speed as if that's going to help them. And then they're surprised when, they're all twisted by the time they're 18, 19, or 20. So these are the reckonings we need to have as a society. And we're not really having them. We can't have them civilly. And some of these things, if you even bring them up, you're immediately branded this or that or the other IST, whatever of the day. So it's led to a lot of self-censorship. Like during the corporate cultural revolution of 2020, I pretty much I wrote a lot, but I didn't publish much. I had quit teaching by then. I was pretty horrified with what universities had become. But I mean, that was Maoist to me, honestly, that summer, irrespective of politics or anything else. The notion, the whole, it's not enough to say, I don't like racism or whatever. You have to perform it. And that's a Maoist struggle session. And that comes, ironically, that came to America through the Weather Underground, the radical 60s group, ironically, that were many of the teachers and leaders of Black Lives Matter. And so, you see this kind of national struggle sessions and senators on their knees and all this nonsense. And I was thinking, like, this is secular religion. This is transcended politics now, and I want no part of it. And that lost me some friends and got me called a racist and this and that and the other thing, and so be it, But the best critics of that moment were the black leftists, the real Marxists, like Barbara Jean Fields at Columbia. The level to which university students these days are encouraged to see themselves as victims is not healthy. And it's not healthy for them. It's not healthy for society. The idea that you're going to have the normal pangs of angst and fear that all humans have, and then suddenly it's a condition, it's a syndrome, it takes a pill, and next thing you know, you're, staring like a neutered cat, on SSRIs. Like, I don't want to go there, and I think that, it'd be very hard to get to the core of some of these issues because of, more than anything else, corruption. And, the founding fathers always talked about corruption and faction. And we've just grown deeply and profoundly corrupt. Much, the kind of stuff I'm seeing now, especially with Trump, not to just constantly pile onto him, but I mean, Hunter Biden was bad, but Hunter Biden, you could see, at least had enough of a sense of I don't know about a sense of shame. That's probably an exaggeration, but he at least was trying to hide it, right? Right now it's open. It's just straight up, and this takes us back to, I read about this in leftist African politics class in college, and it's Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, and I saw this also in Cambodia, and it is, when you are in power, that is your license to steal, and that license has an expiration date, right? Because when you get out of power, that license gets revoked. So you got to steal as much as you possibly can during that time in office, and and you've seen this with the defense industry, the stuff I saw as a contractor in the military industrial complex. It was staggering. And these are the things that need to be addressed, but these things have gotten so entrenched within our systems, it'd be very difficult to do. I don't think it's impossible. I could see a real populist rising. I would like to participate in one. But, and again, we're in such a volatile whipsaw period of American history. Really, nothing will surprise me at this point. Your frequent guest, Kevin Maurer, and I often have lunch and, discuss this stuff. And again, we're both kind of to the point where very little will surprise us.
Yeah, that is true. And that's unfortunate. But that doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to remain agents of moral courage. And you are doing that through your writing. So I will put the link on how to subscribe to your Sour Milk Substack in the episode description. So thank you, Peter, for an amazing discussion. We've gone all kinds of places.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a lot of fun.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.